week of our CEPR International Trade and Regional Economics New Member Series. This week we have Jose Vasquez, who is Assistant Professor at London School of Economics, and he'll talk about nominal rigidities and the China shock. So same format, pretty freestyle. People can jump in and ask questions, or if they want to type, Jose may not be paying attention. I can voice those. So go ahead, Jose.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides? Oh.
Yes.
Okay, and you see them moving. Okay. All right. Well, first, thank you very much for the opportunity to present and for being here today. This is joint work with Andres from Berkeley and with Mauricio from the San Francisco Fed. And as usual, we have the disclaimer that whatever I'm going to say today doesn't represent the views of the SFed, San Francisco Fed, or the General Reserve Board more generally. So the motivation of our paper starts from the main findings of the very influential paper of Autor, Dorn, and Hanson 2013, where they find that the commuting zones that are more exposed to the increasing import competition from China experience important labor market effects. So now let me focus on the three regression coefficients that I have on the red square. The first one tells us that a $1,000 per worker increase in import exposure from China significantly increases the unemployment to population ratio by 0.22 percentage points. And that the labor force non-participation to population ratio increases by 0.55 percentage points. And they also find that import exposure leads to a non-significant decrease in population of 0.05%. These are, of course, difference in difference regression results that identify relative effects between local labor markets with different levels of exposure, but it doesn't identify any aggregate or general equilibrium effects. But still, the magnitude and the existence of these estimates are hard to square with the predictions that we sometimes have from the standard trade models that we use to quantify the welfare effects of something that we call the China shock, or trade shocks more generally. And in particular, models that do not feature unemployment effects could give us a very incomplete picture of the overall effects of trade shocks, because these unemployment effects are usually central findings in the empirical literature side the shocks. So these findings would suggest that there's potentially some labor market imperfections that precludes local labor markets from adjusting in real time. And we're gonna build a model that wants to explain the overall welfare effects of the China shock while being consistent with these empirical findings. So how can one rationalize the effects that I showed you in the red square in the previous slide? One can start from the standard gravity model of trade with multiple regions, multiple sectors, and an input-output loop. And in this simplest version of the model, there is, in the simplest version, there is perfectly inelastic labor supply, so that there will be always full employment. So any effect of a trade shock will happen on prices and wages. So one can then easily accommodate changes in employment by adding an upward slope in supply curve, and then interpret involuntary unemployment together with non-participation as people engaging in home production. This is the fix that most of the literature has implemented so far. And then in this case, when the wages go down, then the employment level decreases and the economy moves along the supply curve. One limitation of this approach is that if we want to match the large effects on employment that we observe empirically, we will need an unreasonably high labor supply elasticity, much higher than what the labor literature has found in order to be consistent between the model and the empirical findings. Another issue is that even if we have employment effects, we cannot talk about involuntary unemployment. So of course, the welfare implications of such a model would be very different. So if workers go home because this is optimal for them, because they have something better to do there, then actually non-employment will act as a mechanism to smooth or to mitigate the shock. But if the shock causes some people who want to work who are willing to work at the market wage, but they remain unemployed, then the welfare effects could be even the opposite. So to deal with this issue, we proposed a quantitative trade model that incorporates downward nominal wage rigidity as a mechanism to deliver involuntary unemployment, which, as I mentioned, having the unemployment effects is a common thing that you find in the empirical literature. And armed with our model, we will calibrate the model to match regression coefficients from ADH that I showed you in the previous slide. And then we will, with the calibrated version of the model, we will study the welfare impacts of the China shock. In principle, one can calibrate a trade model with search and matching fictions to generate also unemployment effects from a trade shock. But what happens is that in this type of models, what the search and matching does is that it amplifies the terms of trade shock. And what I will show you, we could have a positive terms of trade shock that actually could have either positive or negative effects on unemployment, which is a degree of flexibility that you don't find in the models with search and matching. And of course, the general equilibrium implications would be quite different from the two models. So what do? We start from the state-of-the-art dynamic trade model and trade and migration model of Caliendo, Working, and Parrot, which I will refer to as CDP. In their model, agents have migration decisions across regions and sectors governed by a single elasticity. So the first thing we do is that we extend their model to allow for a different elasticity governing workers' mobility across sectors, which is 1/nu in our model, and then elasticity governing labor mobility across regions, which is 1/kappa in our model. And these different elasticities will be critical to match the causally identified moments from Autor, Dorn, and Hanson. We then add downward nominal wage rigidity, similar to in the paper of Smith, Grohe, and Uribe, which studied the effects of reversal of capital flows on economic activity. So it's a totally different question, but we borrow the way they model downward nominal wage rigidity. And this will introduce a third parameter that we call delta, which will govern how rigid the nominal wages are. So in particular, we assume that the nominal wage in each region has to be greater or equal than delta times the nominal wage in the previous period. And this will imply that the nominal wage can only fall at most 100 times 1 minus delta % each year. So just to give you the parameter that we find, think of delta equals 0.98, which is what we will find in the data. This would mean that nominal wages can fall up to 2% per year, but not more. Of course, the exact implications of how we model downward nominal wage rigidity will depend on other assumptions regarding monetary policy and what we assume on the exchange rate. But our results are broadly robust to a range of different assumptions of these features. And so then after that, we do counterfactual exercises using the exact dynamic Hat Algebra technique that allows us to solve for the transition path of the economy, giving a sequence of future changes in fundamentals without making any assumption about the levels of the economy fundamentals. So this is very nice, something that we borrow from CDP in this extended version of the model that we have. And then for our quantitative analysis, we put together a data set that has trade flows between regions, between United States and countries, and between countries. And also we add flows both in terms of trade and migration. And in the end, we will focus on a resulting data set that we put together, which has 14 sectors, 12 of them in manufacturing, 1 service sector, and 1 agricultural sector for the 50 US states plus other countries. As is common in the literature, we will model the China shock as an increase in productivity in China that varies across sectors. And we will calibrate these sector level productivity changes so that we match the imports from China to the US. We match to whatever we have in the data. Then we will pick the 3 important parameters that I told you about in order so that the simulations of the model will match the causally identified coefficients from the ADH. So basically we simulate the model, then we run regressions in the world of the model, and we choose the parameters at the point in which the regressions that come from the data simulated by the model match the regression coefficients that we have from ADH in the same empirical context. And finally, we just studied, once we have the calibrated version of the model, the general equilibrium effects of the China shock on the aggregate employment and welfare.
Jose,
Yes.
just clarification at this point. Why states and not commuting zones?
Yes, that's an important question. So it happens that states is at the level in which we can have the necessary data. In particular, for instance, trade between the US local labor market and different countries. So we can have sector level trade for the different sectors of California with France, with China, etc. At the state level. We will require additional assumptions to go at the commuting zone level. For instance, we could assume that then within this trade of the state is proportionally spread across commuting zones, depending on their economic importance or population ratios at the beginning of the period. But when we just stick to the US state level because of the data. But this is not a limitation of the model. The model, of course, can accommodate more regions. Okay. So just a very quickly, a quick preview of the findings. We find that the downward nominal wage rigidity has a qualitative and quantitative importance implications for the ways the US states adjust to the China shock. For most of the states, in the end, we find that the China shock is a positive terms of trade shock because they're using intensively inputs that are produced by sectors in China that experience a productivity shock. When we simulate the China shock without the downward nominal wage rigidity, we see that only one state suffers declines in employment and in welfare. And in this version of the model, it happens that, okay, nominal wage can decrease, but the price index decreases even more. So in most of the states, real wage increases. However, when we have downward nominal wage rigidity, there are 8 states that experience welfare losses and 31 states experience unemployment during the transition. And in 7 out of the 8 states that experience a welfare loss because of the China shock, in those 7 states, the China shock is still a positive terms of trade shock, but they lose in welfare because of the unemployment generated in the transition. And for us, this is the most important qualitative insight of our paper. So even states for which the shock improved the terms of trade could experience welfare losses. So the downward nominal wage rigidity is not only amplifying the terms of trade shocks, but it could even reverse them. For instance, a positive terms of trade shock that will require a large enough nominal decrease in wages will hit the downward nominal wage rigidity and generate unemployment. So something that was supposed to be good at positive terms of trade shock could end up being something bad for that region, for that state. At the aggregate level, we find that the China shock accounts for 1.5 percentage points in unemployment. And in general, the introduction of downward nominal wage rigidity will decrease the gains from trade of the China shock from around 1/4 to 1/3 compared to the benchmark without the rigidities. Just to mention in the literature, we will try to bridge this large literature studying the effects of trade shocks, and in particular, the distributional and aggregate effects of the China shock, with a more macro literature that has focused on the existence and importance of nominal wage rigidities. And we're trying to bring this to a quantitative trade model, which is something that we haven't seen before. Okay, so now let me just give you the baseline model. Because of time, I won't be able to talk much more about it, but we have some other bells and whistles that we include in the paper. Then the data and calibration and just the baseline results. And for all other different specifications and extensions, I will refer you to the paper. Okay, so in the baseline model, we will have I regions. M regions would be in the US and I minus M would be countries. We have S sectors plus a home production sector. And we assume that there is no labor mobility across different countries, but we allow for costly mobility between US states and sectors. In each region J at period T, a representative consumer will participate in the economy and will devote all the income to expenditure. We will have a Cobb-Douglas preferences across the S sectors, and within each sector, we will have an Armington assumption. And then in terms of production, we will also have a Cobb-Douglas production function that uses labor and intermediate inputs and this would be under perfect competition. Then we will also assume as the same as before that intermediates from different origins are aggregated in the same way as consumption goods with the Armington assumption. So the preferences and technology assumptions that we'll have will give rise to the following price indices that you see there, and to the standard gravity structure of trade between regions, which is very common in the quantitative trade models. So in the baseline model, we will assume exogenous trade deficits. So we will take the trade imbalances as in the data, and then we will gonna keep them fixed and exogenous and constant throughout the periods of analysis. And in the extensions, we consider other alternatives. And the rest that you see here are just standard market clearing conditions. We have that the total revenue of a sector is just the sum of demand from final consumers and from other sectors, just multiplied times the trade share, which is standard. And finally, in the standard model, we would have that the sum of employment across sectors would be equal to the total number of workers in the economy, implying full employment. But we will see how we will deviate from this. So now let me tell you about the labor supply. We will include an upward sloping labor supply curve in our model by just including the option of home production. Here, so agents can decide whether they engage in home production or they look for work in the labor market. If they engage in home production, they just receive a constant utility flow. If they participate in the labor market, they can be employed in one of the sectors and they will have some expected real income from participating in the sector, which is equal to omega IST in this case. So as in the model of CDP, agents will be forward-looking and they will face migration decisions that are subject to sectoral and spatial mobility costs and given some idiosyncratic phase shocks. We will add the nested structure where we will allow for different elasticities of mobility across sectors and regions while keeping the tractability here. And so in terms of determining how the labor supply works for every region sector pair, we will have this participation decision in the idiosyncratic phase shocks, and then labor supply in each sector will evolve over time, depending on how people decide to move across sectors and regions. In the absence of downward nominal wage rigidity, this model will be very similar to the one of CDP, in which there's no unemployment, and then the expected real wage will be equal to the effective real wage in each sector region pair. But once we have rigidities, then the amount of wage or income that the worker gets depends also on the probability of employment. So when people decide to look for a job in each sector, they might think, well, there's some real wage that I get if I am employed, but there's some probability that I don't get a job. And of course, this formulation that we're using has two strong assumptions. The first one is risk neutrality. So the agents only care about the expected real wage, and that's it. The real wage they get times the probability. And the other one is that there's some perfect insurance option, like some perfect insurance in which we are just, the representative agent is not that someone gets fully unemployed and some others get the job, but it's just, we care about the expectation. And also in this case, if we are precluding people who look for a job and don't find one to then return to do home production. So that's an assumption that we're keeping, whereas basically the intuition would be that if someone is looking for a job, this takes time. And even if you don't get one, then you might keep searching, and then this precludes you from going home and enjoy the same utility flow as everyone else who decided before to go home. Okay, so now let's talk about the nominal wage rigidity. First, the nominal wage rigidity will be defined in local currency units. So the nominal wage in local currency units in a given sector at a given point in time, what will be, cannot be lower than delta times the nominal wage in the same local currency units in the previous period. So in this means that the wage cannot fall more than 100 times 1 minus delta % per year. And this also means that employment in a given sector could be lower than the total labor supply. And it's something that we will capture with a complementarily slackness condition, in which if there is unemployment, it must be that we hit the wage rigidity, the lower bound. But we now need to bring back the rigidity to dollars instead of local currency units, so that it's comparable across all the regions that we have in the model. And to do so, we need to multiply this times the exchange rate, which is E in this case. And of course, this will then keep us entertained, thinking on the potential assumptions that we will have to what happens to the exchange rate. And I'll talk about it in the next slide. So there are two things that we need to take stance on. The first one is what is happening to the exchange rate for other countries. And we consider two polar options. The first one is one in which we have in the baseline, which is full flexibility. So we assume that other countries just depreciate or appreciate accordingly, so that they make the nominal wage rigidity non-binding, and then they don't experience unemployment. The second option is to have a fixed exchange rate. So in this case, the downward nominal wage rigidity of those other countries would be exactly the same as the one in the US, because everything is in dollars and the exchange rate is fixed. So in this case, other countries will also share the burden of unemployment with the US. The second important decision or stand that we have to take is that the presence of the downward nominal wage rigidity will require us to introduce a nominal anchor. Why is this important? Because otherwise, you cannot prevent that the nominal wages will just rise so much in each period that the constraint is always non-binding. So what we do is that we choose a simple nominal rule. And our objective is to capture the idea that central banks are unwilling to allow for high inflation because it has some related costs that are outside of the model. And we need a rule that is also amenable for quantification in our very rich trade setting. So in the end, what we do is that we assume that the world nominal GDP in dollars grows at a constant rate that is gamma over time. So in the last equation, we have on the left-hand side, the world nominal GDP at time t. And then on the other side, we have the growth times the nominal GDP in dollars in the previous period. So at the end of the day, what matters in our model would be the gap between the gamma and the delta. For instance, even if there is a lot of downward nominal wage rigidity, if we have a high enough gamma so that inflation, let's say at the world level, is too high, then all nominal quantities are going to adjust up, and the downward nominal wage rigidity won't be ever binding. So what we do here is that we will follow Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe, and we will normalize gamma equal to 1, so that all the burden of the adjustment is going to fall on the delta. So when I give you the result of the delta that we have, you just have to take into account that this is just happening for a world in which gamma is equal to 1. And of course, we acknowledge that this way in which we're capturing the nominal forces is simplistic relative to the state of the art in macro. And of course, for instance, a more satisfactory approach would be having like a Taylor rule and zero lower bound and savings and investment decisions, etc. But what we are trying to do is to capture these forces using this simplistic rule in a way that is we can include a rich trade structure with many countries, many sectors, and still being able to conduct a quantitative analysis in a transparent way. And of course, we hope that this serves to identify other key elements that other models will need to incorporate. Okay, so very quickly, we will just use dynamic Hat algebra using the US states as for the US states and other countries. We will have data at the beginning of the period, and we won't need to calibrate the technology levels or the iceberg trade costs, etc., along the transition. So we will assume in this case that these forward-looking agents didn't expect the China shock at the beginning of the sample. Then the China shock hits, and then they just learn about it. And to operational this, to make it operational, we will assume that the economy starts in a situation without unemployment in 2000. And then we will use the calibrated version of the model just to compute the welfare, employment and welfare hats which are the counterfactuals relative to a world in which the China shock didn't happen. Okay, I think in terms of, let me just talk about the data very quickly. What we require in this case for the quantification of our model is use data on trade and migration for 50 US states, 36 other countries, and an aggregate rest of the world, so that we will have a total of 87 regions and we will study the period 2000 to 2007. We will consider 15 sectors: home production, 12 sectors in manufacturing, 1 of services, and 1 in agriculture. And for the case of the countries, we will take the sector level bilateral trade from the WIOT, World Input Output data set. For the US states, we will compile a combination of data sets. For instance, for manufacturing, we will use the commodity flow survey. Then for trade between US states and other countries, we will use a data set that is compiled by the US Census Bureau. And then we combine these data sets with data from BEA and from WIOT using a number of proportionality assumptions, so that everything aggregates back to the trade of the US with other countries and the trade of the US with itself from the World Input Output data set. And finally, also we take from the CPS and the ACS data in order to construct the migration flows also for the US in this period.
Jose,
yes.
Quick question. So the trade imbalances in dynamic Hat algebra are treated as they're just some terms that disappear. Is that right?
That's correct. And
they don't adjust. They are kept as fixed.
So in our baseline model, we keep them fixed at the value that they have in the first period.
The question is, what are they denominated in, and how are both exchange rate regimes compatible with doing that?
So in the denominator, if I understand well your question, would be with respect to the US GDP at the beginning. So we just keep the proportion of the US GDP that is the deficit as fixed exogenously at the value at the beginning, and then all other things adjust, but we just keep that that fixed. In one of the extensions, we still don't have endogenous deficits or something like this, but then we just have some sensitivity analysis. What if we allow part of the China shock also to influence the deficit in the US? So we just change basically the denominator that you were mentioning. And then in the end, there's some interesting results. For instance, making the deficits bigger, it's actually hurting the US in our model, because you're allowing even more trade, and then this changes, it makes the nominal weight rigidity even more binding in the manufacturing sectors, and then the employment effect could be slightly bigger. But in all cases, it's fixed. It's not like the paper of Rafael Carneiro and co-authors where they have an endogenous deficit or something. This is, in our case, it's just as you said. Okay, so now let me tell you about how we treat the exposure measure. So we will calibrate the China shock first, we will use the exposure measure, which is the same, or it's very similar, at least we try to do it as close as possible, but we have US states instead of commuting zones, to the one that ADH uses in their paper, which is basically a Bartik measure of the importance of the sector level employment in each labor market. And we use the predicted imports from China the same way as in ADH. And this predicted increase is just a projection of the changes in imports from China to other high-income countries, and we use the same high-income countries. So we try to be as close as possible to them in order to measure the exposure. And then we calibrate the change in technology in China in order to match the change in US imports in manufacturing from these sectors in China. So we basically decompose the total productivity shock in the sector S and time T into two components. basically, it's one that is the productivity in China that varies yearly, but it's the same across sectors. And the other element, which is some time invariant change in productivity that is different across the different sectors. And what we do is that we will calibrate these ones such that we pick the productivity changes in the way that they match the total change in imports per sector in the US between 2000 and 2007. And also every year, the yearly change in aggregate imports from the US, of the US from China. Okay, so now let me tell you how we do with the remaining important parameters in the model. First, we don't do anything about the trade elasticity. We just set it to 5 in all sectors. As I mentioned before, we will set the rate of growth of the world nominal GDP to 1. So all the burden of adjustment is on delta. In the baseline model, we will have flexible exchange rates in the way that other countries will adjust the exchange rates for them not to have unemployment. And we calibrate the other parameters, delta, kappa, and nu, so that the model will match the effects of exposure to the China shock on unemployment, participation, and population from the main specification of Autor, Dorn, and Hanson, basically the coefficients of the regression in the red square in the first table that I showed you. This calibration will give us a delta equals 0.98, which means that the nominal wages cannot fall more than 2% per year. And we find reassuring that this value is just very similar to the one that Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe find using a different approach. Okay, so one thing that we think is interesting is that we perform some exercises just to make sure whether the assumption of one elasticity governing the mobility across sectors and regions is relevant, or whether we need 2 of them. And we find that in order to match the empirical evidence, we will require significantly different elasticities of mobility across sectors and regions. Because if we set the elasticities to be the same, like in the CEP model, we will have too little effect on participation relative to what we see in the data, and the effects on population will be too large relative to what we observe in the data.
Sorry, which one was which? And so which one is very elastic and which one is not elastic?
So the one that is very elastic would be the one of mobility across sectors. And the other one not so elastic is the one of mobility across regions. Okay, so now let me show you the baseline results, which in the end is here in column 1. What we have is the results from ADH with the significant stars given the regression. We have a series of moments that we simulate in the model. Some of them are targeted, the one that you have there in bold targeted. These are just regression coefficients that we use for the calibration, so that the model delivers these regression estimates that coincide with the regressions of ADH. And however, we don't do like a terrible job in other non-targeted moments. This is a very simple baseline model with the assumptions that I told you. In the paper, we have other specifications that are a bit richer, for instance, allowing for rigidity to be different across sectors, or something that I see along these lines that will help us a lot with the improve the fit of the model in the non-targeted parameters. What is interesting here is just the change in welfare that we have in the two. Now, of course, you cannot compute the welfare in the ADH, but in the model, we have the change in welfare in a world in which there is nominal weight rigidity, and the change in welfare in the world in which there's no downward nominal weight rigidity. And we find that the difference is around 1/3 of what it was without rigidity. So there is still welfare gain for the US as a whole, but the gains in the world with rigidity are like around 1/3 to 1/4 smaller than the nominal, the welfare change in the case without nominal weight rigidity. So one thing that we find interesting is just kind of to do a breakdown of what happens to several states. So for instance, we have that there's even without downward nominal wage rigidity, there is one state that loses in all specifications because this state experiences a decrease in the terms of trade. So let me just, which is what I'm gonna highlight here. Then there are 7 states that have welfare losses in the case with downward nominal wage rigidity, but they would have experienced welfare gains in the case without downward nominal wage rigidity. And why is that the case? The reason is that the China shock will require a very large nominal wage decrease. If there was no rigidity, nominal wages will have decreased and also price indices in a way that in the end there's an increase in welfare because the real wage would have gone up. But in the world with downward nominal wage rigidity, the economy cannot adjust the nominal wage, and then there's some excess in the labor demand and labor supply, so that there is unemployment. And if you compute the present value of the utility across the transition path, it seems that these states would have experienced welfare losses, or experience welfare losses with downward nominal wage rigidity. In general, most of the states still experience welfare gains, even if some of them experience unemployment in a transition. So most of the states experience unemployment. Some of those that experience unemployment have welfare gains, which is the case for 23. Some of them have welfare losses, but we find interesting that, so there's unemployment in those cases, but still welfare goes up in those cases. So just to give you some intuition of what happens in the model, so assume that you have nominal wage on the y-axis, and then you have employment here. The China shock hits, so there is a contraction in the labor demand, and also this affects the price index. So prices become cheaper, and this encourages labor participation. So that's why the two curves move. This is what would happen in the case in which there was no downward nominal wage rigidity. We'll find an equilibrium that will be one in which we have a lower nominal wage, but higher employment. So this is in the case in which the China shock is a positive terms of trade shock, which is what we find in the model without the rigidities. But now that we have the rigidity, what is going to happen? Then we find that there is a limit in which the nominal wage cannot go below this point. So labor demand still contracts. Labor supply doesn't change as much as before, and the employment level will be given by what the intersection of the rigidity with labor demand. So this will have this new level of employment. As time goes by, the economy is allowed to adjust because the rigidity that we have is just yearly. So this is how much nominal wages could change from one year to the other. So in the end, the economy will be moving towards the same equilibrium as before, but it's just that the transition path is very different because it will start moving as slowly as the nominal wage rigidity allows. And then the next period, you will still have unemployment, but the gap might be shrinking and shrinking and shrinking overall until you arrive to the equilibrium, which is the same as before, but just the transition is different. If we look at what happens to unemployment in normal, we will have that at the beginning, we start from a point in which there's 0, then the China shock hits, and the China shock starts hitting differently in different periods. And unemployment starts increasing, and then here we assume that we stopped the China shock in 2007. So then at that point, the China shock was smaller and smaller. So there's still cumulative unemployment because of the slow adjustment of the economy. But every year, the China shock is smaller in our calibration. Then once the China shock stops in 2007, then the economy ends up readjusting again. So the nature of unemployment in our model, of course, is temporary. So we go back to 0 unemployment. But what we're interested in is to study like the gains or losses that come from this transition. In the end, the economy will adjust to the long run point where in most of the models would have gone from A to B to this, from the initial economy to the final economy. But here we just have a different adjustment mechanism. If we think of how welfare changes with respect to exposure, so this is something that you couldn't do in the usual ADH evidence, because we cannot have a sense of welfare in that empirical difference in different specification. But once we can quantify the model, we could have the welfare changes for different states, and we could see how that changes with welfare, with exposure. And we find a negative relation. In particular, if you increase the import competition by $1,000 per worker more, then the relative welfare would go down by 10 basis points, basically. And we find that, so there's still a negative relationship between exposure and changes in welfare, which is something that many people have in mind when they hear about the ADH evidence. But the interesting part is that still most of the states still gain, even if this negative slope exists. There are some losers from the trade with China, and some are like the usual suspects. But in general, as a whole, most of the states end up benefiting. And one thing we could do, since we have the analysis at the sector region pair, is to fix, let's say, a worker at the beginning of the shock, depending on the sector and region pair in which this worker was, and then compare the changes in welfare of that worker that was lucky or unlucky to be at that point in time in that sector region, and then see how this compares across local labor markets, so in particular sector region pairs. And we see this histogram of welfare in which there's still like a big mass of sector region pairs, or workers that start in these sector region pairs that would gain welfare from the China shock, but still there's considerable heterogeneity and many losers as well. One thing that we like about this model that hasn't been present in other recent models is that models like the one of CDP, of the one of Simon, Moises, and Andres, the slice in the pie have, is that they struggle to match the spatial heterogeneity in the employment and income effects of the China shock. So these models, like, you could talk about welfare, etc. But then if you, in the world of the model, you run a regression and you just want to see how dispersed are the employment effects, relative employment effects, you will find a lot of dispersion in the data, very little dispersion in the predictions of the model. This is something that has been highlighted by other recent papers. And in our paper, we are able to produce more spatial variation in the income and employment effects because of the downward nominal weight rigidity producing an unemployment when the economy hits the minimum, and also in part because of the way in which we define labor supply that I told you, that you're not allowing people to decide to go to the labor market, to be unemployed, and then to return to enjoy home production. So this assumption also helps us because the existence of unemployment also acts as a discouragement for labor force participation. So agents would say, okay, there's a chance that I get unemployed and I might not be able to return to home production, so I better go to home production now in some cases. So the combination of the rigidity plus this other effect is allowing us to have a lot of variation, even more than the one that you could find empirically in ADH, but similar in terms of variation across space in the income and employment effects from the China shock. Now approaching towards the end, we could take our model and just do an exercise of what would be the job losses, or basically measuring what is this missing intercept that you will get from the ADH type regression. So in the case of ADH, we learned that if you increase $1,000 per worker, increasing import competition, this would lead to a changing employment to population ratio of 0.77 percentage points, in which case 22 basis points come from unemployment and 55 from changes in labor force participation. So here we're just bundling them. And as I said at the beginning, this is just relative, more exposed versus less exposed. So if you want to say something at the aggregate, you need to make some assumption here. The usual assumption that people who run this type of regressions do is to assume that a labor market with zero exposure will have a zero effect. And that's basically assuming an intercept of 0. If we run with this naive calculation, then we'll have in total around 4.4 million jobs lost from the China shock. However, once we have the model, we can basically find what the correct intercept of this regression would be, because we have the absolute changes in employment and not only the relative, and then we can estimate this regression in the world of the model, and we have a negative intercept, meaning that in this case, local labor markets with zero exposure will actually gain employment. And once we have that, we could do a back on the envelope calculation. And actually we find that, okay, there are job losses from the China shock during the transition, but then we'll have, once we run the regression, basically doing a not naive, but a back on the envelope calculation using the correct intercept, we could find around 500,000 jobs lost. And if we don't want to have an approximation, but actually use the full machinery of the GE model, we find that the China shock produces around 470,000 jobs lost during 2000 and 2007. And 2007 is the moment in which we stop counting the losses. They are in long-term gains. So if you look at the China shock as a positive terms of trade shock in the long run, which is what our model is telling us, there will still be a higher level of employment in the long run. But then the number I'm giving you here is just the job losses that we can measure from 2000 to 2007, which accounts for 1.5 percentage points in the total unemployment of the US around that year, which is a significant chunk of it. Okay, just to finish, what we do and what we find is that this downward nominal wage rigidity mechanism can explain the falling unemployment and the increasing unemployment and increasing non in the labor force participation in a way that we can match very nicely causally identify reduced form parameters. And with that mechanism, I still have like quantification in terms of total aggregate employment effects and welfare effects. We have qualitative and quantitative implications from the China shock that are very interesting. Even states that experience a positive terms of trade shock could still lose in the presence of downward nominal wage rigidity because of the unemployment generated in the transition towards that better equilibrium. And we also find in general that once we take into account the downward nominal wage rigidity, the China shock still is positive in terms of welfare for the US, but the gains are from 1/4 to 1/3 smaller than in the world without nominal rigidities. And of course, there are some big assumptions behind our analysis. For instance, the way we deal with the nominal anchor, which from the point of view of macro might be very simple. We try to capture the right things, but we acknowledge that future work should address to have more realistic nominal rules. And also, as I said before, we have this perfect insurance in which we are looking at the representative agent in each of the local labor markets. But of course, if you look at the fact that some people lost their employment and their lives went much worse in the future because of that, then once we go to a more granular level, possibly we could have larger losses from the China shock. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jose. So I'll open the floor to questions, and I'll start with one. So coming back to the last point that we also discussed, more granular analysis. In principle, you could do this at the, say, commuting zone level in terms of labor market moments, and then for the trade flow moments, you can aggregate it up to the state level. But I guess then you can't do Hat algebra because these things have to be consistent. Like, is that a calibration challenge, or is that a?
No, it's just an assumption
challenge?
on the data channel. So we could do what you suggest. If you think that you believe the assumption that you split, let's say, the trade of California with China as a whole, and you split it in the commuting zones of California according to population size or population share, so that the more populous commuting zones import more from China in a proportional way. So assuming zero heterogeneity there. Then if you like that assumption, we can do our paper at the commuting zone level.
Suppose I don't like that assumption, but I may not have to make it if I can't exactly match all the moments, right? If I just minimize sort of a sum of squared errors, then I can't.
So you were saying, okay, I see. So if I understand well, you were saying we could still match at the state level the trade of California with China, right. And at the commuting zone, it would be whatever the model uses to fit.
Yeah, we don't see
them. I think we
the
can
model
do that.
Generates them, but you aggregate it up to the level that data is available.
Yes, I think that's possible. I will have more free, so there is nothing put in discipline on what it would be of one commuting zone versus the other. But if we have something like a gravity structure that imposes a little bit more discipline there, I think we can do it that way too.
Others, I have other questions, but please feel free to go ahead. If not, I'll shoot one more. So it would be interesting to take your 8 states and see in the data if they have above or below, or there's no systematic variation with respect to unionization. Like you would be able to say, look, these are precisely the states that need downward rigidity, but we see that 6 of them actually have highly unionized manufacturing sectors. So institutionally also, they're
I think that's an excellent point. We haven't thought of, I mean, we were having a discussion among the 3 of us saying, well, there are some institutional factors that would make some states having stronger nominal wage rigidity than others, or more binding, but we never correlated which are the states that their model tells us that where it's more binding versus some measures of these institutions, like unionization is one of them. But I think, that's something.
I understand that
something
bringing that variation into the model and calibration is hard. I mean, there may be a way to do it in a very ad hoc way, but I understand it's hard. So exercise is pretty clean and transparent as is, but then you can kind of go to the data and see whether they
like corroborative evidence that what the model is giving us is sensible, that is capturing some
actually,
I think it's something.
Actually there's no reason why they should align. In principle, these are historically determined, right? There are a lot of sort of path dependence on past, there's a lot of like south-north differences in right to work versus the Rust Belt. But if it happens to be that the states that are actually hurt most from nominal rigidity do actually have some institutions that would make it worse in those terms. It's kind of
I agree. I totally agree. It doesn't have to align, but if it does, it will support the story.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks.
But otherwise, thanks a lot. If there are no other questions, we'll thank Jose and Dennis. I see you coming in. Any questions? Okay, then in 2 weeks, June 20th, We'll listen to Shenxi Xu talking about geography of international banking over 2 centuries. And Jose, thanks a lot again. The talk will be, I think, available in CEPR's website if you agreed to it.
Yeah, I think it's already there.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you. It was nice seeing you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.